Hello, I'm Sarah O. Lamb, Senior Fellow of the Technology Policy Institute. Today, our panel is the last of six in the TPI Winter Spectrum Series. Today, we are discussing international spectrum leadership. We have joining us Scott Blake Harris, co-founder and managing partner of Crest Advisors, Umair Javed, General Counsel and Senior Vice President at CTIA, the Wireless Association, Jennifer Manner of Z Scientific, LLC, and Trisha Paoletta, partner at Harris Wiltshire Granis, LLP. Last week in our Spectrum series, we discussed the 2025 Spectrum Agenda and touched upon international issues. Today, we will deep dive into WRC 27 and the process of consensus-driven U.S. delegations at the international level. With us today are truly some of the leading experts in spectrum policy at the international level. So thank you for joining us. My first question for our group in a lightning round is, what do you think are the top international spectrum policy priorities for this administration, FCC, NTIA, State Department for the coming year and looking ahead to 2027?
Who would you like to start?
We don't have a buzzer, so you tell us, Sarah.
You like to start, Scott?
Sure. Look, I don't know what the administration's priorities are, but I would like to suggest one that it needs to focus on right away, which is the location of the 2027 WRC. It is now most likely to be in China. And let me underscore this. It cannot be in China. It cannot be in China because most members of the delegation from the federal government will not be able to attend. Even those from the private sector will have to go with burner phones and burner computers. If this work is held in China, it is guaranteed to be a disaster for the United States, and it cannot happen. And it takes time to find alternative locations and to fund alternative locations, and the U.S. government needs to focus on it now.
So I'll jump in. I think that's a great place to start, Scott. I think he really kind of hit the crux of the matter. The reality is that for many, many years, the United States has been the most important champion, sustainer, and defender of an open, sort of rule-bound international system that's been grounded in multilateralism and grounded in international law. And I think the reality is that system is facing a very credible and well-resourced threat from our adversaries, including China. I think a priority for the United States going into the World Radio Communication Conference is that we continue to find a way to work with our allies and our partners so that we are the ones promoting technological process and advancing democratic values and protecting against national security threats at the World Radio Communication Conference and at the ITU. Most generally, I think that the World Radio Communication Conference has been an incredibly important venue for advancing those goals. And traditionally, the United States has benefited from driving the focus of that conference, including driving the spectrum focus of that conference. And I think we need a return to that norm. If I can add one additional thought, I think another priority for us should be recognizing that the United States was the first to use auctions to license spectrum. But that was an incredibly successful model that was copied by the rest of the world. And we went to the last World Radio Communication Conference for the first time not having auction authority as a country. I think that is something that we cannot repeat. We can't get to the next World Radio Communication Conference and not have solved that problem. So I would add to what Scott is saying that should be another priority for the United States, is restoring the FCC's authority to auction spectrum licenses.
Okay, and I'll jump in. I certainly agree with the previous speakers. My apologies, Sarah, for not having caught this earlier. The law firm name is now just HWG because Scott left us and we can't use his name. So just HWG. But in terms of the other priorities, yeah, we're not far enough along to kind of figure out what might be the priorities from an industry perspective. But because of the challenges that Umair and Scott addressed, it's a priority to get our region behind us. And that does require us to have our own domestic positions locked down soon so we can begin working with our allies in the region, our neighbors in the region. And we did see at the World Radio Conference in 2023 a bit of a schism. We used to be least the last two World Radar conferences, we benefited from a more cohesive region. We did see Mexico and Brazil being a little more open to the suasion of China, whether those were legitimate means or illegitimate means. But so that's a challenge, and we got to be working on that. So we come into this World Radar Conference, which will be difficult no matter where it is, but with a more cohesive region behind us.
So, and I would agree with all the speakers. And on China, I do want to say China is hosting the Study Group 4 meeting in April. And that's a good example where we're really only able to send a very slimmed down delegation from the US. And we're still waiting for State Department's final determination if we can send anyone. But it's not just government folks who may not be able to attend, but there are some companies that are under sanction and so forth who can't attend as well. And I did want to follow up on Tricia. The BRICS countries have become extremely cohesive at the ITU and very effective. And going back to what Umair and Tricia said is we really need to get our build bridges with our allies, get common positions, and start working that. So we do have to finalize the U.S. positions. We may not share them, fully with people yet, but we need to start talking to folks and start socializing and start building those. We're really not very far away. So about 6 months before the conference, we'll hold our conference preparatory meeting, and it's really critical that we start to have support as we prepare the CPM report. I do want to say one thing that I do expect to be a priority for this administration, which is not expanding the jurisdiction of the ITU. And I think that is important to all of us because we need to have certainty on the important areas we're working on, spectrum allocation and so forth. And we have seen a number of countries trying to expand the jurisdiction. The ITU is resource constrained, just like any bureaucracy or any government agency. And by expanding it, you start to take away from its core functions, which are really the allocation of spectrum and protecting users from harmful interference. Thank you.
I'd like to pick up on what Jennifer says in two ways. Number one, we've been fighting ITU jurisdiction expansion for 30 years. It is a constant battle. I do assume this administration will oppose that expansion as it should, and as our government has through every administration since the 90s at least. The other thing I want to talk about briefly is the U.S. process. Jennifer mentions we need to get our act together. Our U.S. process is itself, in my view, broken. It simply takes us too long to get U.S. positions so that we can advance them internationally. If we're fumbling the ball as we're going down the field, we're never going to score. And we have been fumbling it for years. And last year, frankly, the last work was a good example of that. This administration should get its act together soon. I suspect it will, but it needs to, most importantly. That means decisions need to be made over the different views of NTIA, FCC, industry, and the Department of Defense. The process cannot drag out. There have to be folks in place who can make decisions in the best interest of the United States writ large so that the delegation can go out and advance those positions overseas. And finally, once those positions are adopted, everyone on the delegation, every company on the delegation in particular, needs to support those positions. At the last work, we saw companies that were on the U.S. delegation use their overseas affiliates on other delegations to oppose the United States. It's not a right to be on our delegation if you're in the private sector. If your company is going to be on that delegation, it needs to support the U.S. position or it should just leave.
So talking about process some more, what types of reforms would help the US side kind of be more functional? Other countries seem to have a more straightforward process of selecting a delegation or finding consensus. Of course, the US is larger, more complicated, but do you have some particular recommendations?
I think, Jennifer, you're on mute, so I'm going to jump in. The U.S. needs to appoint or select a senior official that has an impressive ranking, title that so they can negotiate with their peers, ministers or chief regulators, as soon as possible. For years we've had a 6-month special government employee come in at the last minute and be an ambassador. I know there's some pros for that, which we can talk about later, but you don't have time to develop the relationships and knowing who's where, let alone the technical positions of the different agenda items, because these are very complex. And a World Radio Conference agenda has about 30 to 40, considering the next agenda issues to sort out. So, the Trump administration should get a senior official in as soon as possible to be the point person to carry the water for the U.S. and World Radio Conference.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think maybe if I could take a step back and put it in a little bit of context as well. I think the reality of our current situation is that there is a broader reconsideration of what the United States commitment to multilateral organization looks like at the moment, right? We know that President Trump signed a pretty sweeping executive order early in his tenure that does mandate a comprehensive review of all of those organizations of which the United States is a member. I think the explicit purpose of that exercise is to determine whether such support should be withdrawn or whether it should continue. And the reality is that the clock is ticking on that review. I think the immediate targets are narrow and unsurprising, right? It was the likes of the UN Human Rights Council, UNESCO, the World Health Organization, but there's certainly more under consideration under that executive order. It includes the UN generally, it includes the ITU specifically. Now, look, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong about periodically reviewing U.S. global commitments. I think that can be a healthy thing as long as we do it thoughtfully and judiciously. And I think that the question for the administration will be whether we continue to pursue our priorities sort of in that multilateral system, or whether we think we can do it better in a more regionalized system, or whether we can sort of replicate the capacities of those organizations through new arrangements, whether they're ad hoc or bilateral. Sort of that was a suggestion when we announced our intent to pull out of the World Health Organization. So there are these options, I think, to consider. How are we really pursuing our priorities in this international environment? I think whatever the answer is, it comes down to where we started, which is ensuring that we're not allowing other countries to dominate emerging technologies, that we're setting the rules and the standards and the practices that are adopted globally. And I think that flows into some of the things that Tricia was laying out about if we are going to continue to stay committed to these processes, ensuring that we've got early leadership, domestic processes that work is going to be very important.
You're still muted.
Jennifer, you're still on mute.
Oh, I'm not.
There you go. Now you're on. We can hear you now.
Oh, you can. I have no idea what happened, so I'm sorry. I have a brand new computer, so I apologize. So I agree with everyone, but I wanted to bring up something else, which is the actual process for deciding U.S. positions and the input from private industry. One of the concerns, and I've been in and out of the government now 4 times in my career, and so I've seen both sides quite a bit, 4 times in the government and then out, I think 5 times. But one of the concerns is that the process is not very transparent when we're getting to the most contentious issues or even the uncontentious issues. And I do think there needs to be process reform where there's more transparency on how the positions are ultimately developed. And I've seen it done in a number of, it depends on the ambassador, the work leadership, but I find that the delegation with that transparency, even if you're not getting what you want, understanding how those decisions are made ends up with a more cohesive and committed delegation. So that's something I would ask, is that there be a look at to see how we can increase the transparency. And I do want to just put a pitch in. I've been doing this for a lot of years, since work 95. And I do think that on the ITUR side, it is critical, especially I've been in the space industry for most of my career. It is critical in order having harmonization of spectrum and having technical rules which we can operate, that there is such a body. I'm not saying the body can't be done better or can't be reformed or can't be made more efficient, more transparent and so forth. So I do hope the administration keeps in mind as they're doing their review that this process is important. We have 80% of the WRC 27 agenda items are space related. So it's an important time, including communications on the moon, which is a hotly contested item. So just putting out a couple points, Umair, to balance a little bit of what you said, but do agree there the review is appropriate and should be had.
So if we're going to talk about the ITU, we should also talk about ITU process reform. Again, the last work was, I think, the worst example of the ITU process that I've ever seen. The chairman of the conference shut the US out of the room, not having a voice at all during critical decision-making points, saying he was only going to allow folks to participate who were representing regions. And the US was not representing our region, and we were locked out of the room. If that's going to be the way the ITU operates, it shouldn't operate. I agree with Jennifer that it can perform a valuable service. I think over the years, it's been a great forum for the United States to advance its goals. But if the organization is going to operate the way it did last time, serious changes need to be made at the very least. The process was broken last time, and it worked to the disadvantage of the United States, and we can't allow that to happen again.
If I can jump in on that too, there are general rules for World Radio Conferences that the ITU has put out there, but they are very general, and the tradition has been whoever is hosting the conference gets to have a little more say in the actual vital decision making. And what was the process last time was that each region, and there's 3 ITU world regions, and the Americas are region 2, right? Each region has a war coordinator. Ours was from Mexico. And then on a particular issue, that war coordinator from CTEL or from the European group or the Asia Pacific Telecommunity, African Telecom Union, each region gets to send their person. So yes, there was sometimes when the US was actually not the person who was sent by the region 2 CTEL coordinator, and that could have some, did have some negative effects. So yeah, so I quite agree with Scott. There has to be more clarity on decision-making process for award, and so that probably has to be done at these other ITU meetings in the next 2 years. But that underscores again Scott's opening point that if China's chairing this, they will be able to direct the decision-making, and for on most of these agenda items, not all, but on most of these agenda items, we are at crosshairs because of supporting different industry bodies for these services.
I think part of that too is just ensuring that the United States domestic process is working and appropriately supporting our international advocacy and participation. That the United States being shut out of that room or not having a seat at that table was not a surprise. That was something that delegation members warned leadership about well before the conference, that was a very real possibility. If the United States went to the conference without developed positions on key issues, they would not have a seat at the table when it came time to negotiate final text. And that's exactly what played out. It wasn't a surprise. I think people knew that was the dynamic that could happen. And nonetheless, the United States went to that conference without those developed positions. I think that is what we need to fix. And that's what our priority needs to be for the next World Radio Communication Conference, is that we're not putting ourselves at that disadvantage again.
I fully agree with everyone, but I want to bring up one other point. One thing the U.S. has, can you not hear me again?
Look, too very quiet.
Oh, I have no idea. Is that better if I talk
better.
closer?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, never use a new laptop for an event, but I agree with everyone. I think they're good points. I want to bring up one other thing that I think is an important process improvement, is the U.S. has not been very good at using its private sector members to get international support. We used to have a very, very fleshed out approach where we selected folks, especially folks with language skills and relationships, to go reach out and build bridges with countries early on to help bring support. We have not effectively done that. There was an ambassador many years ago who Scott and Tricia probably remember, Gail Shetler, who was masterful at this. And once again, I think using your delegation and using the members that are on your delegation. One of the things the U.S. has, it has a very robust industry presence on the U.S. delegation. And a number of those countries are companies are multinational and can get that support. And I think that also helps guard against what Scott was talking about. If you have a delegation that's just sitting there and isn't able to actively participate, it's much easier for other portions of their companies to act against them. If the company is engaged and part of that, it does make it harder. So I think that's just another reform I would urge, because we do have a very talented delegation, more so than most countries. And I don't say that for idle flattery or because I serve on the delegation quite often, but I think it's actually true. And I think there's a lot of skill there, and especially in a world where China's getting stronger, the BRICS countries are working very effectively. I think we have to bring our A game if we're going to be successful at WRC 27 and going forward.
I'd like to say one nice thing about the work process, because I'm generally very critical of it. At least for the last war, despite the fact I think it did not go well as well as it should have, the cooperation between the U.S. federal agencies, specifically the FCC, NTIA, and state, I thought was fabulous, and I'd just like to see that continue. I thought the career staff at state, at FCC, and NTIA worked really hand in glove in a way that I had not seen before. Very often our federal agencies can get crosswise, particularly in the heat of international negotiations, but they did not in this instance. They worked together really carefully, really quickly. I was in the US, we were getting calls at 3 a.m, trying to get everything worked out. These folks did a great job, and I would just hope that would continue. That was one strength of our delegation at the last work, and it's an important one.
Yeah, I think that's right, and there's certainly opportunity to build on that. I think as we're having this conversation about sort of the U.S., how it develops its positions, how it goes into the conferences, I do want to kind of zoom in on that a little bit and suggest that this is, I see a dynamic that I think is new, a dynamic that I saw for the first time in the World Radio Communication Conference back in 23, that I thought was a little bit different than the struggles that the United States domestic process has had in the past. And what I mean by that is, in the past, it's certainly been the case that there have been contentious issues that try to get worked through in our domestic processes to develop positions for international advocacy, whether it's through the FCC's WAC or elsewhere. And we have our process, and there's not agreement, and we try, and we just don't come up with a consensus position. That I understand that certainly happens. I think increasingly what I am seeing is people adopt the view that we shouldn't have a position. Not that we tried and we couldn't reach one, but we actually should not have a position on certain issues going into these conferences, on important issues. I see this most in IMT agenda items and bans, where increasingly you see people advocate for things like either we should not have a position or we should not have an international position until we have a fully settled domestic position. I do think that that's a new dynamic. I think it sets us up for failure when we get to the conference. And I think it misunderstands how the World Radio Communication Conference works and what its outcomes mean for domestic policy. And so that is something that I think the new administration should focus on and hopefully put at least that type of advocacy to bed very early and say, we are going to try to have positions. We are going to work the process and see if we can come up with consensus in advance of the conference.
Yeah, and I'll follow up with that just with the kind of on the ground reality, right? That when we didn't have positions on particular issues, and terrestrial or satellite, sometimes the spokesperson, the U.S. government spokesperson or the CTIA spokesperson would take the position that, or would assume, well, I can't speak to that, even though text is being negotiated on, how many hertz and how many dBs and ERIP, technical issues. Now, I can't say anything because the U.S. didn't take a position, and that did hurt us. And that's maybe overly strict an interpretation. I would be kicking the person and be like, yes, you can get on the mic, say X, Y, Z, because again, we're lawyers here on this call. It's it's not written that you can't speak on the mic if there's not a U.S. government position. You can't engage in negotiation, and sometimes that was used selectively. But yes, I think if we have clear positions, we are better able to engage in on-the-ground negotiations as they unfurl minute by minute.
And just building on that, I fully agree. I think one of the things we have to do too is we were very stressed at the conference of not having enough spokespeople. There were only a certain number of people who were empowered. They weren't necessarily the experts. Sometimes our experts are in industry. And people were running between rooms. I was in rooms where we had no US spokesperson for a period of time because people were so tight. So I think the other thing, just to be effective, if we are going to speak, we need to make sure we've empowered, and that may sometimes mean empowering industry, and industry is under an obligation to follow the US position to speak if someone in the government is unable to because they're caught in another negotiation. For those of you who haven't been at WRCs, there are multiple rooms and negotiations and side conversations and so forth. So it's very easy to not be able to leave one room to go to another. And I think that's critical, is making sure that even if we're short on staff for whatever reason from the government side, that someone is empowered to pick up the microphone, and we have confidence that they will follow the US position, which is their obligation as a US delegate.
I'd like to double down on what Umair and Tricia said about the US taking positions. I'm all in favor of consensus when you can get consensus. But the truth is, there are issues where the US delegation will not come to consensus. The private sector just has too many different interests, diverse approaches for you always to be able to get to a consensus position. The US government runs the process, and the US government, I believe, should be more decisive and make decisions, right? They may go against my point of view, they may go in favor of my point of view, but it's to the advantage of the United States writ large to have a position, and it can't always be arrived at through consensus. And I would urge this administration, and it's got the right people in place in the various agencies to be willing to make decisions and decide what the US position is, even if it's not a consensus one.
And what are some of the consequences that you see of the US, not speaking up or not participating? Like what is that worldview? What happens when the US is weak at the ITU?
Increase market access for our technology.
Yeah, other countries drive the decisions. The decisions about spectrum, right, tend to drive the decisions about technology, about equipment and stuff like that. And so if other countries drive spectrum decisions, it will inevitably favor their manufacturers, their technologies, and disadvantage US manufacturing, US technology, and ultimately US economic growth and technological innovation.
I see Jennifer trying to speak, so I'm gonna let her try to get in here before.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can now.
Okay, that's so weird. But anyway, but that can include increased restrictions. And sorry, that's the dog. Sorry. That can include, so anyway, bad audio day. But anyway, that can include stricter restrictions and regulations, including things that US companies can't meet. And we're seeing that as we've talked about the expanding ITU jurisdiction. If we start to stop taking positions and advocating, we could end up with a much broader ITU mandate in areas we don't want. And we could end up with situations where we're blocked because we can't meet, maybe someone decides to choose the technology. The US has always been that we should be technology neutral. We could end up with non-technology neutral rules and things. And as Tricia said, that would block our market access in a number of countries. So just adding on.
Yeah, I think everyone hit it exactly on the head. The United States has benefited immensely from being able to harmonize the spectrum we're using domestically with our allies and our partners. And we see that in market access. We see that in economies of scale. We see that in roaming agreements. We see it in handset deployment. We see it in so many places. And I think There was a report by Accenture not too long ago that the benefits of harmonized spectrum to the country, and I think they calculated it or quantified it at something like $200 billion if we're able to continue harmonizing the spectrum we're using for IMT bands in the United States. So obvious benefit there. I think that, look, we live in a world of increasing technology competition around the world. And it's interesting, the sort of the debate that I see playing out, where in the United States, we're having this conversation about our national power potentially coming from our military continuing to hold spectrum assets. And there's a lot of focus on that right now. If you look at what China is doing and how they're thinking about it, they certainly have taken this view that national power is going to come from the success of their commercial technologies and their ability to proliferate them to the rest of the world. So you see that in their strategy, in the way that they're trying to harmonize spectrum use around the world as well. So they get the benefits of those economies of scales and that market access. We saw that play out in the early 5G, in the early run up to 5G, where some countries who were deciding to deploy 5G in certain bands only had one choice for a vendor, and that choice was Huawei. And that was because that spectrum band had not been harmonized and the US was not using it. And so the equipment manufacturers that were serving the US markets were not building equipment for those bands. So that's what we're talking about here. I think the harmonization debate has obvious benefit for the wireless industry, but it goes beyond that as well, and goes into questions of national security as well.
Great. So I guess taking it to specifics a little bit more, there are a lot of, I think, lunar moon issues that are going to be coming up. And so that really is an international greenfield. What kind of competition is there right now for lunar rights?
Tremendous competition. I think starting with Trump 1 with the Artemis Accords was a great idea that the administration has. I don't know the exact number, but last time I checked, I think it was 50 or 60 countries have signed up to work with the United States on the Artemis Accords, which is exploring the moon. But at the same point, China wants access, every country wants access. And we're in the throes of discussions right now on what does that mean? It also matters to terrestrial interests as well. I'm sure Umair can talk more about this, is, what is it, there's going, for the moon, but also for future, I was going to say heavenly bodies, but I think planetary bodies is the right term. Planetary bodies, what does the allocation scheme look at on the moon, on the planet? Is that look like, is that done through space sciences? Is that done through allocations to, more terrestrial, mobile services, how that does? And there's just a huge amount of focus and discussion on that. So the next meeting is scheduled. I haven't been to those meetings. The next meeting is scheduled next month. And those are always hotly contested. So I don't know, Umair, if you want to add anything on that.
No, I think I think that's right. Look, there's the aspect of sort of what does spectrum use on the moon or other places look like. I think there's certainly also the aspect of transmissions back to Earth, right? Ultimately, there needs to be that component of the system as well. And I think from the terrestrial perspective, that's where we start to get interested, because we want to make sure that as we're pursuing obvious new opportunity, we're doing it in a way where we're also protecting the incumbents that are deployed terrestrially.
Yeah, and well, Sarah, I'm glad you raised it, because it's a fascinating area, right? And there's mining operations on the moon. China's already making moves there. We all know, I think, this much about it, even though we're lawyers, it's colder up there. So there are companies that are looking for data storage up there on the moon, and then bring the data down when you need it. And there's US companies that are innovating that space. There's allied companies that have lunar nodes they've already launched, and so it's a very exciting area. So that's definitely something that's captured a lot of attention. It's not as contentious as some of the other issues, which you're probably going to get into, but I think it definitely captures political attention.
When I was at NTIA, we met with a variety of companies that wanted essentially to build commercial networks between Earth and the moon, so that those landing on the moon, doing providing services in space, could just pick up on existing networks and not have to create their own networks. It's an extraordinary thing if you think about it, right? Commercial networks between Earth and the moon to service all the various industries that they expect to take place on the moon or in the space between the Earth and the moon. It's an astonishing thing, and folks have not yet gotten their heads around it, but there's a lot of thinking focusing on it now. And what the ITU's role in that is another question, right?
Yes, I mean, could you unpack that a little bit more? How much is it, first mover advantage, or does the ITU make rules after the fact or before?
That was part of the debate. Did the ITU even have jurisdiction on that? And some people did not want to see the ITU move into that space. But since China's already up there, we've got interests up there, we've got military and Coast Guard interests up there, that the feeling was, but if we don't have rules, China's going to do whatever they want. But I will defer to our two more recent government panelists that expound. So you got to lean more in, Jennifer. Still can't hear you.
Still can't hear you.
Maybe touch your mouse. I don't know.
Yeah. Does that work?
Yes.
Okay.
Whatever you're doing, don't stop.
Okay. So the ITU does regulate deep space missions, which are much farther out than the moon. So I think it's pretty clear the ITU does have a role to play. Question is, what does it look like when you're talking about planetary on-planet communications? So you've got two issues is, there are filings, ITU filings that have been made by US companies and other countries, US government and companies, I should say, but other countries as well, to put satellites around the moon. And we know that there's projects going on, but also it's the on-moon communications. And where I think this is critical is it's going to set the precedent for what's done should we reach Mars and other planets, which, the moon is very small. Let's be honest. It's not a big piece of geography. But why it's so is important is there are valuable resources, we believe, but more importantly, it will set what goes on going forward, for the next millennium, let's say.
So maybe coming back to Earth a little bit more, should we talk about the IMT ban? So those are a little bit more contentious for our US industries. What do you all foresee for 7 and 8 gigahertz and other bands?
Yeah, so I'll jump in there. I would love to talk about the IMT bands. So I hope that this is not contentious. And I want to start the conversation by talking about sort of where we are domestically and how that should inform where we go internationally. And domestically, I think what we see, speaking for the wireless industry, is a need for additional licensed spectrum opportunities. And we see that need, I think, driven from two angles. The first, I think, is just looking at the numbers, looking at capacity. Last year, I think US wireless networks carried more than 100 trillion megabytes of data across the country. That is more than double what networks were carrying 2 years prior to that. In those 2 years, no new spectrum assets were made available to the industry to help keep pace with that demand. And I think if you look at projection going forward, it's only going to go up from there. I think the prediction is about 2.5 to 3 times by 2029. And right now we've got no licensed spectrum opportunities in the pipeline to help support that need. And the FCC, as I said at the beginning, has lost its authority to auction more spectrum to support that need. The second angle, I think, from which we see that need is what I call the keeping up with the Joneses. So if you look at what the rest of the world is doing, the United States is trailing on the amount of mid-band spectrum that's available for IMT for 5G use. And so we've got a deficit to close there as well. At the ITU, there are 2 bands under consideration that can help address that need for the United States with harmonized spectrum, and that's the 4 gigahertz band and the 7 and 8 gigahertz band. I think both of those are really important opportunities for the United States. The 7 and 8 gigahertz band, I think, is a uniquely critical band for the wireless industry. And part of that is because of what happened at the World Radio Communication Conference in 2023. What we saw there was alignment in many parts of the world to use the upper part of the 6 gigahertz band to pursue 5G or 5G and beyond technologies. That band is not available in the United States. The full 1200 megahertz was allocated for unlicensed use. And so the question for the United States becomes, what is our answer to that? Where are we going to go if it is not going to be with the rest of the world on the upper 6 gigahertz band? 7 and 8 gigahertz, I think, provides the answer to that question. It's right next to that 6 gigahertz band. It means we can benefit from being in the same tuning range. Actually, at Mobile World Congress in Barcelona, a lot of vendors were previewing radios that were operating from 6.9 to 7.3 gigahertz, meaning they were straddling that band. That means we have an opportunity to be in the same ecosystem, device ecosystem, as the rest of the world. So for us, I think the 7 and 8 gigahertz band is an incredibly important opportunity. I think 4 gigahertz falls into that same category. It's a band that we've looked at in the United States that NTIA and others have studied and looked at as a potential opportunity for commercial wireless use. It was not part of the national spectrum strategy, but I hope that this administration can bring that back into the conversation as well.
I have to jump in here too, just to refute some of those data points, right, Umair? Yes, wireless network traffic is growing. It's growing, well, it's slowing down a little bit, but it's still growing and exponentially. But what you forgot to mention is more than 90% of that traffic is terminated or originated over Wi-Fi. So Wi-Fi is a very important component of that, both in the United States, right, and and in this, I should say, in the national spectrum strategy that Scott had worked on, and in the bills up on the Hill that are looking at the data spectrum pipeline. There is a recognition that we need more unlicensed spectrum as well, given that growth in traffic. And of course, the 7 gigahertz band is being reviewed for unlicensed as well. And in terms of what the rest of the world is doing, I don't think China's ability to bribe its way through Region 1, in particular in Africa, really reflects what the world wants to do. There are actually far more countries that have decided to allow unlicensed 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi across the full band than has done in the upper 6 gigahertz band today. I mean, even China, right, which has authorized it, hasn't actually deployed it. And then Hong Kong, I guess, was pressured to have an auction, and the auction came in very disappointing results. And even hit the ceiling. So I don't think it's fair to say the rest of the world is clamoring for upper 6 gigahertz IMT. But in terms of us being behind, I don't agree with those numbers either. I mean, the U.S. has allocated a lot of mid-band spectrum for licensed cellular, and this FCC Chairman Carr, right, is looking at trying to expand that core band, right, from up to 4.2 gigahertz into the C-band, and that might cause some concern with obviously the satellite guys, as well as go below, right? And again, the Spectrum Pipeline Act is looking at, in the 3 gigahertz and above. Of course, the National Spectrum Strategy was looking at that. So we are doing what we need to do in that core band, and there's room to grow at the ITU on that core band. I mean, but the mobile industry, so you're not just the wireless industry. I'm part of the wireless industry too. Umair has the unlicensed guys. Yeah, the core mobile band, right, is 3 gigahertz, but there's not that much actually allocated in the World Radio regs. So there does need to be more work. It's not the high profile. Let's identify the whole region for IMT, but there's more that can be done in that mid band and the core band, 3 to 4 gigahertz. And as Umair said, that 4 gigahertz is being studied. Unfortunately, it's not being studied in Region 2. Or I should say, unfortunately for you. But as we've seen it work, sometimes the regional limitation does not actually limit the outcome at a conference.
So, since both Tricia and Umair mentioned the National Spectrum Strategy, which I was not going to mention, I would like to say the hypothesis behind the bands that were being studied was that there was spectrum available both for high-powered licensed services and for unlicensed services, right? So I think once those studies play out, if they're allowed to play out, as I suspect they will be, there will be spectrum available for both. Concerned about, if you take that discussion to the international level, is that we had decided to study the 7 and 8 band domestically and opposed being studied internationally. And what that tends to do is take the United States out of the discussion, which we talked about before. The one thing we have to avoid doing is sidelining ourselves in these discussions, because it's not as if the rest of the world is going to wait for us. It's not as if the rest of the world is going to say, the US has no position, so we'll just hang out. The rest of the world is going to move forward. So we need to lead the parade. We can't be sitting on the sidelines watching the parade go by, whether it be 7-8, whether it be 4, whether it be lower 3. The US needs to lead. It traditionally has, and we have to keep doing it because we haven't been leading, I think, with the vigor we once did, because we find it too hard to make up our own minds.
And I want to maybe react to some of what Tricia was saying, because I do think that is, some of those views are exactly what hamstrung the United States, I think, at the last conference. But just, taking them one by one, perhaps, on the traffic question, I think I do want to emphasize that the traffic growth here is real. And the 90% metric that Tricia is talking about how data is used in the United States does not change the amount of traffic that our networks carried. That was over 100 trillion megabytes. Yes, there's a lot of traffic on Wi-Fi as well. There's a lot of traffic on wireless networks as well. That's growing. That's very real. That traffic is not slowing. What you have is a larger base to begin with every year. And so every increase over a larger base, you can look at that and say, well, it's a slower growth rate, but you actually have larger growth. So the rate might be slowing, but the growth is actually increasing. It is a very real challenge in the United States for America's wireless networks, and one that we seriously need to solve if we're going to continue to be globally competitive, not just in 5G and 6G networks, but in all of the technologies that operate on top of that. The reality is that if you even considering Wi-Fi offload, even considering densification, even considering the other things that wireless industry can do, economic analysis by Brattle, by others, has demonstrated that we are going to have a spectrum deficit. By 2027, that's going to be about 400 megahertz. By the 2030s, in about 10 years, it'll be closer to 1400 megahertz. You cannot engineer around this problem. You cannot offload this problem. There's got to be a spectrum component in order to solve it. Wi-Fi certainly is a very important technology for the United States. We allocated 1200 megahertz of contiguous spectrum for Wi-Fi growth. The rest of the world did half that. They're deploying the same technology, the same capabilities, realizing the same benefits on half the spectrum that the United States has allocated. We're over-indexed on that. We don't have a congestion issue there like we do on our wireless networks. I think that's what the discussion about the 7 and 8 gigahertz band is about. The RLAN community would like additional spectrum in 7 and 8. The argument for it is so they can operate another 320 megahertz channel in addition to the ones they already have. There's currently no use case that exists that requires that additional 320 megahertz channel. Meanwhile, you have a real scarcity problem on the wireless side. You have a real problem of the rest of the world going to 6 and us not having a solution that makes that 7 and 8 gigahertz band uniquely important to the United States. And to sort of make an analogy to what I'm talking about here, these two technologies are very, very different. Saying that 90% of connections terminate on Wi-Fi networks is sort of like saying my car is parked at my house 90% of the time. That doesn't mean that I want a bigger parking space at my house. It means I still want more lanes on the highway. The technologies are just different in the way that they reuse spectrum and actually operate. You don't have that congestion problem. You don't have that use case need on the RLAN side that you do on the wireless side. I think ultimately, a lot of times you hear this argument of, well, China wants to do the 5G. That is what I think the United States missed the last time about the real global dynamics of what was happening at this conference. 6 gigahertz was not just being driven by China. France was a big part of that. Europe was a big part of that, and they continue to be. Mexico and Brazil were a big part of that. And the reason was that a lot of these countries, mobile penetration is still a very big problem. And they come to this conference looking for solutions to close the digital divide in their countries. And the United States went to this conference without an answer for these countries about how they can do that. But other countries did have an answer. And what we shouldn't do is go to the next conference with that same dynamic and that same problem, where countries are coming looking for a place to close the digital divide in their countries, and we're not giving them an opportunity or an answer on how to do that. So I think supporting 7 and 8 gigahertz for that INT agenda item should be a priority for the United States.
Brazil and Mexico came to that conference willing to do China's dirty work. And Latin America has a ton of spectrum that's allocated for IMT, and they haven't deployed it. And they have much of the midband, the core midband, 3.3 to 3.8, has not been deployed in Latin America. 700 has not been deployed in Latin America. So no, I reject that we were not prepared. We didn't have an answer for the rest of the world. Our answer was use Wi-Fi. It's really good stuff. And an extra 320 megahertz does give you deeper, more low latency virtual reality applications, extended reality, augmented, all those, new enhanced technology, plus densification. But I don't want to I know I'm being selfish now, but Umair, you and I should go out for coffee. We'll fade it over, over a private discussion.
No, but it is a very important discussion because, barring, no one really knows, it'd be nice if the market could test the two viewpoints. Are there ways for other than lobbying or just weighing the balances?
And the market is global. You can test the two value propositions. There have been no deployments. You can correct me, Umair. No deployments of licensed cellular IMT in the upper 6 gigahertz band circa March 18th, 2025. Meanwhile, you've got a dozen countries around the world in each region of the globe that have deployed unlicensed across the full band. And by the way, it's not just, the United States gave that 1200 megahertz away to Wi-Fi. There are incumbents in there, and the thinking at the FCC was, okay, those fixed incumbents can continue doing their important stuff on it, including the cellular industry, but also energy and public safety, satellite, right? So you can squeeze in Wi-Fi because of its best efforts and listen to talk.
So I would like to jump in simply because I think Umair and Tricia must be getting tired of talking to one another at the moment.
No, I'm not.
And say that long before the next conference, we need to decide what our position is. I think we have gone into conferences with this kind of divide and with no decision. And the one thing I do know is that internationally, that approach is a loser. The United States needs to have a view, and we need to then be able to advance that view internationally. And one question I have for folks, because I've been thinking a lot about this, is given the sort of international turmoil with our relationships with some of our traditional allies, is that going to have an impact when we get to work? Right? Can we turn to the Canadians the way we normally do and almost surely get support and get that support this time or maybe not?
Well, regrettably, Canada was less of a they were less reliable this last World Radio Conference because they had a particular bee in their bonnet on a particular satellite agenda item, and they did step up quite to the same degree as they have.
Well, I don't mean just right. That's sort of an example. The question is, do we think that the traditional relationships on which we have relied at these conferences will be the same? Domestically, right, spectrum has been blessedly nonpartisan issues, right? There are lots of divides. Partisan isn't one of them. Internationally, though we have always relied on our allies, and I just wonder what folks think about that going forward.
So Scott, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think this is a real issue because, as everyone is probably aware, WRC alliances are not formed purely based on spectrum. And you'll often be involved, and I learned this very early on, that there's things that are traded for certain decisions that are outside of the ITU process. Could be totally different. It could be aid. It could be weapons. It could be support. It could be anything. So I do think we're going to be in a bit of turmoil, and that's why you see the embassies involved. When we go to the WRC, the only people aren't there are the normal spectrum agencies. There's a political dimension to that, and that's why we have a U.S. ambassador. So I think before the conference, we really need to look at that and see where we need to do certain outreach and where we need support. So it goes back to, Scott, what you said and everyone said at the beginning, is we need to know where we're heading early on, because we're going to need to build those alliances, and it's going to maybe be a little more complicated this time. And so getting
So that's
political-
exactly where I was going.
Yeah,
I think my instinct is it will be more complicated. All that means for us, though, is that we need more outreach sooner
Exactly.
than when what we're used to.
right, exactly. And maybe more thoughts about how to bring people together on certain issues. I think that will be that's a more political issue than a day-to-day, you know, I just need support on this. It's more, how do we bring people together to support? And I think there will be certain schisms that'll be harder to repair this time.
I think that ties back nicely to, Sarah, the question you asked about how do we make some of these decisions about what to prioritize and what to pursue. I think ultimately the United States has always pursued a balanced spectrum policy, and I think that's what we need to continue to do. I think increasingly there is this view of we should have this one size fits all policy on spectrum for everybody, that everyone should just do low power or shared or Wi-Fi. I think the important thing is having balanced spectrum policy, ensuring that we're leading on all fronts. We're already leading the world on spectrum availability for Wi-Fi. We need to be leading the world on spectrum availability for IMT as well. Today, China is violently opposed to 4 gigahertz and 7-8 gigahertz being identified for IMT. And that is part of the strategy to keep wireless networks in the United States starved of spectrum. I think we need to have a position. I think we need to be going to the conference with it. And I think it needs to be a balanced position.
And in terms of, I guess, our last question and personnel. So right now, Doreen Bogdan Martin is a U.S. citizen. She's the president of ITU. Do you foresee that she'll stay there? And who is there a good short list of folks who could be ambassador for the U.S. delegation?
I think the other 3 people on this panel would be my top 3. It's a great question. You know, I think Doreen is up for re-election in 2026. I think so. I think that's an early question.
2027.
2027. I'm sorry. So that's an early question for the administration. Is how the United States strategy around that as well.
Sorry, you may be right. It may be 2026. I'm confusing it with the WRC. So
the funny pot, right? 2026. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry.
And I would like to say there is I think, a reasonably long list of folks who are really quite capable, who this administration could appoint as work ambassadors. I mean, I think there's actually a pretty deep bench. If you take a look at the appointments they've made so far at NTIA and at the commission, you can see there's a deep bench there.
But I want to go back to what Tricia said, which is the importance of getting someone on early. So with Ambassador Koh, for instance, because she had been part of the administration, they were able to detail her to state. So she did have a little more runway than just the 6-month appointment. And unfortunately, the 6-month appointment is done because you don't need Senate confirmation. So, you know, there is a concern saying, well, have them go through Senate confirmation. We know how hard that is and how uncertain, but we do want to, whoever comes in, and there are many qualified people, we just want to make sure that they get in with enough time and perhaps come in as a special government employee so that they can actually be involved and start doing outreach early as well, which is going to be, as we talked about, maybe a little bit more complicated this time.
Great. So on that note, I guess the number one recommendation to the new administration would be pick somebody now, get them in for the 6-month window to start these meetings and finding consensus. Well, I just want to thank you for your time, and hopefully we can stay up to date and as the years go by. And 2027 is just around the corner, actually. So thank you, guys.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to
you.
everyone else on the panel.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Fun.
Bye.
Thank you.